facilitating this session. I think, comrade. What has been quite interesting thus far in the sessions is that we've been listening to the challenges that we've been confronting as communities and trade unions. What's interesting about this session is that we're going to have the opportunity to really think about, and I think it speaks to Comrade Andile's point, how do we actually start articulating for a public pathway, noting that there's so many challenges. And I'm hoping that from each of the presentations, comrades are going to be a lot more practical. I think what seem to be missing, and I think, Comrade Bruno, your point was something I was actually going to start with. Where is the articulation of our just transition pathway? And I want to be a bit provocative with Sean. I don't think we need, the alternative is there. We were the alternative as the public sector. The point is what they're presenting is the private sector as the alternative because of certain conditions within the public sector. So I think we should be in some ways proactive because we don't want to be on the defensive. I think the answers are there, and the fact that many times after privatization, we go back to the public sector means that the public sector is the answer. We need to be articulating what are the agendas. I think what's also coming through quite substantively, and again picked up by Bruno, your point about how similar the challenges are, regardless of which country you're going to and which part of the continent. If it's happened in Latin America, it then goes to Asia, and then it comes to Africa. And the fact that we continuously, as developed and developing countries, fall into the same trap, repeating the same processes. I mean, it's almost as if, when they talk about us being part of a global village, when you listen to the stories, it doesn't matter which country you're in, the story seems to be the same. It's how do we as labor, civil society, and those who are contesting actually get our act together in the same way that those that are confronting us are doing. So we need a really formidable contestation. So with those words, let me hand over to Comrade Sean, who I know needs no introduction. Thanks very much.
Yeah, I'm going to condense what was planned to be a longer presentation into a very short one, because some of the issues will come up later. I'm going to refer you to the description in the program, because I think it sort of covers what we need to discuss at this point. And that basically is what we're seeing globally is some kind of impromptu reclaiming of energy systems by governments. And it's usually done in context of crisis. Obviously, the Ukraine war led to massive increases in prices, which completely threw the electricity markets into so much chaos. The price increases were phenomenal, and governments intervened both with price protections for end users, but also in the case of countries like Australia, they actually decided to abandon the wholesale markets in electricity. So the question I pose, or we've posed in the program, the organizers of the, if you like, TUED, is how do we turn these impromptu reclaiming initiatives, let's call them that, into something that is coherent, in other words, the public pathway. How do we use this moment and try to connect and the question is, how do unions offer that coherent answer that can cut across all the different situations internationally where this is happening? So I'm going to put up a few slides. You can see this first one is the this is really more a segue into the discussion. This is the Overseas Development Institute. It basically crunched the numbers. All of this is in the framing document, by the way, about how little money has been mobilized by blended finance. The whole idea was, as we discussed in the previous session, billions to trillions. That was the World Bank. Billions of public finance would mobilize trillions in private sector. It was never explained what the mechanism was. Why would public money put on the table be matched many times by private money? It's never been explained. And the more you look, the harder it is to find the explanation. So this, I think, is beginning to fuel our alternative. Now, I want to go back a bit in history. Next slide, please, Irene. This picture was taken 11 years ago, I think, 10 or 11 years ago in Johannesburg at NUMSA. NUMSA organized this conference, Renewables Too Important to Be Left in private hands. So the beginnings of the discussion, and it was very, very superficial, no criticism of NUMSA. Everybody in the room were struggling with, what does that mean, social ownership of renewable energy? It's still in the discourse, but there's lots of disagreement, there's lack of clarity, even in the South African context. And that the lack of clarity is across the progressive movement internationally. Some people believe in local solutions. They think local energy is better than reclaiming energy to full public control. We've had those debates in many national contexts. I can't summarize them adequately here, but we need to be clear as TUED South where we stand on the whole renationalization discussion. This is the development platform of the Americas that was started in 2012 and has been updated since. This is the Trade Union Confederation of the Americas, which is all of the national affiliates to the International Trade Union Confederation. In the PLA, the document referred to returning energy to public control. It didn't really go into too much detail what that meant, but it was there and it was another step in the right direction. Next slide, please. We heard from Comrade Sung Hee and that about the efforts on the Korean trade unions to advance publicness as an alternative to the privatization model in Korea. And that work too has progressed and become more nuanced, more granular, and more convincing, I think, in terms of the public appeal. Next slide, please. PSI, I think PSA comrades will forgive me if I say this. 10 years ago, PSI did not support renationalization. It opposed privatization, but it didn't say we need to take the stuff back that has been privatized and marketized. Now they are supporting the public ownership and reclaiming of energy. That's a big step forward. That's a large trade union body. So we support that transition. Next slide, please. We saw it was a brief moment of hope. This is Rebecca Long-Bailey, the Shadow Minister for Energy. No. Oh, okay. This is Rebecca Long-Bailey, the Shadow Minister for Energy. We worked very closely with her on plans of the Corbyn government, if it was elected, the Labour Party in the UK, to renationalise the energy system. Our intervention there as TUED, I think, was particularly significant because the original document proposed by the Labour Party was very influenced by the German Greens, the idea of community energy, that was going to be the model. We don't need to renationalize. We just need to let communities generate electricity. And it was preposterous in terms, its naivety was unbelievable. But I forgive them because 10 years ago, I would have probably said the same. And I think there's a lot of people had illusions with the German energy model and not seeing its limitations. Labour didn't get elected, as you know, so we got the Tories in power, etc. You know the story. But the work was done in terms of convincing the Labour Party that we needed comprehensive reclaiming of privatized energy, and that became unanimously adopted by the Trade Union Congress in the autumn of 2019, just before COVID. Next slide, please. We saw in 2020 a ferocious battle in France to stop the further marketization of the national utility EDF. Macron was forced to back down, and that was basically a partial but very significant victory. It wasn't just the campaign. It was, I don't even need 5 minutes. It wasn't the campaign. It wasn't just the campaign that was successful. It was that the French CGT, the FMNE, the Mining and Energy Union in France, produced their progressive vision for energy, which included a commitment to decarbonization. Yes, it was pro-nuclear. We would expect that in France with the energy unions being heavily involved in nuclear. But they took the position and they said we need a progressive energy vision. And we've been working closely with the CGT France since that moment. And they came to the founding meeting of TUED South in Nairobi. Next slide, please. This is recent. So as I said, in the UK context, renationalisation was killed off with the defeat of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. A new leader comes in, Keir Starmer. He's all over the place, completely confused on what to do about the energy crisis. And this is the largest union in the UK and probably the second or third largest union in Europe, Unite, urging Starmer, if he's elected and they have a big lead in the opinion polls, to renationalize energy. So it's in the discourse. Next slide, please. This is going back again to TUED's contribution. In 2021, we convened a global trade union task force for a public energy future. We got a big document that's just about, well, I say just about, maybe in the next few months will come out, which talks about the role of reclaimed public utilities and what they would do similar to what they used to do in terms of energy planning and delivery and a public goods mandate, but also what they would do differently in terms of pivoting more towards energy efficiency and conservation. So this is also part of the discussions on reclaiming power companies to public ownership, is what would they do different, what the new mandate would look like. Next slide, please. I'll skip the next few slides, Irene, if you don't mind. I'll go to the ESCOM Final Forum slide, next one. Okay, this was, I think, a significant document. This is now 3 years old. We did with AIDC, Transnational Institute, where it looked at the real crisis of neoliberal policy, the failure of the energy privatization, and the need for a new ESCOM that would be armed with a new mandate. Very difficult message to sell in the South African context, given the purported and real, probably, corruption of the utility and the mafia and the gangsters who were inside it that were brought in as part of the privatization and marketization efforts of the ANC government back in the 2000s. So they blame it on a public entity, but it's the private actors in those public entities who are basically causing the damage. So this was a good, I think, contribution to the renationalization and the reclaiming discussion. This picture, we've got Comrade Martin is in this picture. I'm very proud of this little shot I took of him. This was at a NUM workshop on the public pathway to a just transition, which NUM adopted at its Congress a year ago. Next slide, please. Now, back to the crisis and the opportunities of the current period. This is much more recent. What we're seeing now, I've seen in the South African press, there's been talk about the Vietnam model is to solve the problem of load shedding. And it's a complete misrepresentation of what's going on. It said, Mark Swilling, I hope you're listening, that 8 gigawatts of power was added in 1 year and basically solved Vietnam's energy problems. Wrong. Vietnam has cancelled its feed-in tariff with solar. It's pared down its goals in terms of offshore wind, and it's questioning whether its grids have been, or it's recognizing that its grids have been almost fatally compromised by the input of variable renewable power without planning, without an upgrading in the infrastructure. The Vietnam model is a model of a failure of neoliberal energy policy. So please, comrades from South Africa, check it out, work with us to answer some of these claims that are being made in the media by the friends of the renewable energy multinationals. Now, this is Fitch Rating Agency, published a report in June 2022 that now suddenly realizes that state-owned enterprises are key to the energy transition. That's after they spent 30 years undermining state-owned enterprises and making them financially insolvent. But, and this is true of the discussion we'll have this afternoon, the World Bank has also acknowledged that the poor utilities have no money and they are financially unviable. So they have to, guess what, de-risk, or we have to de-risk private investment so they can get their liquidity back. It's absolutely comical, the policy, but it shows, again, the recognition that there is a big problem in the current policy. Next slide, please, Irene. And we've seen, and we referred to it yesterday, Uganda to nationalize electricity utility, because what we're seeing again is these occasional moments of reclaiming that we need to turn into something bigger, something more inspiring, and something clearer, I think. Next slide, please, Irene. Even Honduras has challenged and cancelled its independent power producer program, And guess who jumped all over the Honduran government? The US State Department, under our friend Joe Biden, decided he was going to threaten a government like Honduras with the investor state dispute mechanism procedures that are on the books. Honduras, though, has not backed down, as far as I know, on this subject, on this issue. Next slide, please. I don't know what this one is. I've forgotten. Ghana. Thank you. I can see now. Yeah. Similar, chose to pay, I think, I may be wrong about these numbers. The Ghanaian comrades will help me. Something like $450 million in compensation to independent power producers in order to get out of contracts that would have cost them $1.5 billion. Again, this is sign of the IPP system being resisted, albeit sort of unconsciously and on a piecemeal basis. Next slide, and I think this might be I got 2 or 3 more slides, and I want to focus just a little bit in the 1 minute I think I have left, which is on Mexico. I don't know if comrades have been able to follow this, but the Mexican government was elected on renationalization of energy. That was one of the main issues. 4 years ago, Morena, a new party on the scene in Mexico, won 60% of the vote, has got now, the president has 80% popularity, which is kind of phenomenal in Mexico, attacked by the right wing, not just domestically, but internationally, for violating the principles of the free market and of being reinstating the national utility as the primary energy producer in Mexico. Now, what Mexico has also done is it's just recently, this came out yesterday, so I won't spend time on it now, but it's hugely significant. First of all, it fined Iberdrola, the Spanish multinational, for basically violating Mexican sort of laws on energy provision. I don't know the details, but then it sat down and bought out the assets of Iberdrola. So it's a renationalization, yes, with compensation, but the government has reclaimed a very important part. It's something like 8 gigawatts, I think, of production. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of public pathway approach to energy transition, next slide, please, Ari. What we've seen Mexico do is a lot of the left, including, unfortunately, a lot of the environmental groups have basically criticized the government in Mexico because of its cancellation of renewable energy contracts, saying, oh, you just want to go back to oil and gas. You want to go back to the old fossil fuel-based economy. I don't think it's true, but I don't think it's false. I think we should be, this is where we come in as unions, and we're working with Mexican comrades to try to put forward this position. This is the largest public solar park in Latin America. It's 400 megawatts. It's going to be 1.1 gigawatts, and it's public between the federal government and the state of Sonora in Mexico. Mexico has also upgraded its hydroelectric systems so it can produce more renewable energy. And it says it remains committed to its climate targets under the Paris Agreement. Again, we're not trying to say that Mexico is a model, just as yesterday we weren't trying to say China is a model, but these are signs, I believe, comrades, that renationalization can become a trend in world policy, and it also can be supported by unions, but we have to make sure it goes beyond piecemeal defense of public energy or even minor extensions of public energy into a full-fledged, full reclaiming of energy in order to set the stage for a public pathway approach to an energy transition. So I'll stop there with those thoughts. Thank you.
I don't think you must, because this is the most powerful presentation in terms of us taking inspiration. These are struggles that are actually contested. Oh, sorry. I don't think you were listening. This was the most powerful presentation in relation to contestation. Amandla! So can we share the enthusiasm even though lunch is on its way? And if Irene, I think, I'm placing the respondents under pressure with 10 minutes each, but perhaps if we can either come back earlier from lunch but I think it would be absolutely important for engagement to happen. It's just not going to happen in the 30 minutes when I've got 3 respondents. So that's just food for thought. Okay, so may I hand over to my comrade from Benin to respond. The floor is yours, 10 minutes.
Oui. Merci, salut camarades. Alors, je me présente à vous, c'est Noël Chadare. Je suis le secrétaire général de la COSI-BENIN, la Confédération des organisations syndicales indépendantes du Bénin. Une fédération syndicale représentative. Et donc, je dois dire un merci à TUED parce que TUED nous offre une opportunité de nous retrouver dans ce cadre si prestigieux avec de grandes personnalités pour participer à ces échanges qui sont riches, très riches et enrichissants pour nous. Et ça, il faut le dire parce que depuis hier, ce que j'ai appris, j'ai beaucoup appris. Je vous remercie pour nous avoir invités à cette occasion. Et on espère qu'on en redemande encore des occasions comme celle-là. Alors, l'autre chose que je peux dire, c'est par rapport au Bénin, le pays, c'est un petit pays. Il est petit pays limitrophe du Nigeria, grand Nigeria. On est frontalier du Nigeria avec le Burkina Faso, le Niger et le Togo. Ce sont les pays avec lesquels nous sommes l'Afrique de l'Ouest. L'Afrique de l'Ouest, c'est un pays de 114 760 km² et avec environ 13 millions d'habitants, 12 900 et quelques habitants. Donc voilà un peu. Et dans cette société, dans ce pays, n'est-ce pas, on n'a pas parlé, on ne parle pas de dénationalisation parce que la société qui gère, qui produit, transporte et distribue l'énergie, c'est la société béninoise de l'énergie électrique, une société d'État qui a survécu à la dénationalisation parce que le Bénin a connu une période de marxisme-léninisme jusqu'en 1989, 17 ans, et tout était nationalisé. Et quand est arrivé le pouvoir libéral, eh bien, on n'a pas dénationalisé parce qu'on a estimé que c'était, n'est-ce pas, une société très, très importante. Il ne fallait pas vendre l'électricité et le privatiser. Donc, il est resté dans le giron de l'État. Quelle est aujourd'hui la situation de cette société dans la distribution de l'énergie? C'est de ça que je vais parler un peu maintenant. Eh bien, nous allons vous dire tout simplement comme à l'instar des autres pays de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, il y a une dépendance, la société béninoise de l'énergie a une dépendance énergétique vis-à-vis du Ghana, du Nigeria et de la Côte d'Ivoire. 90%, n'est-ce pas, de l'énergie consommée au Bénin vient de ces 3 pays. Donc, le Bénin ne produit très peu d'énergie. Il y a un barrage hydroélectrique qu'on appelle le barrage de Nagbeto, n'est-ce pas, que nous avons en commun avec le Togo et qui, n'est-ce pas, produit l'énergie hydroélectrique. Et nous avons aussi la centrale thermique de Maria Glita, c'est ce que le Bénin, les sources de production, n'est-ce pas, d'énergie de la SBE. Alors, le réseau, donc il y a cette dépendance, et ensuite le réseau de distribution de l'énergie électrique qui est obsolète, complètement dépassé. L'énergie conventionnelle, je vais dire, est complètement vêtue sur ce réseau parce que et il y a parfois la grande partie de ceux qui sont branchés, qui ont l'électricité, sont mal branchés. Donc, le taux de l'électrification en milieu rural est de 5% contre 56,5% en milieu urbain, alors que 60% des ménages vivent en milieu rural. Donc, nous avons quelque part cette situation qui montre que c'est comme un peu ce qui se passe dans les autres pays. Alors, dans les ménages, on recourt au bois, le bois énergie, à plus de 59,4% de la consommation nationale. Donc, le gaz domestique n'est pas une réalité pour tout le monde. Très peu de familles ont, c'est un privilège, le gaz domestique, parce qu'il coûte encore cher. Alors, face à cette situation, le Bénin, le gouvernement du Bénin actuel, n'est-ce pas, dit il faut a entrepris des réformes qui sont en vue. Et la Société béninoise de l'énergie et de l'électrique va être, n'est-ce pas, va avoir seulement le rôle de distribution de l'énergie. Et il y aura deux autres sociétés. Il y a deux autres sociétés qui sont en train d'être mises en place. Une société pour produire l'énergie et une autre société pour, n'est-ce pas, transporter l'énergie. Et puis la société béninoise va, n'est-ce pas, va distribuer l'énergie pour rendre un peu plus efficace, n'est-ce pas, la distribution de l'énergie conventionnelle. Mais il faut retenir en résumé que la production énergétique est en deçà, largement en deçà des besoins de consommation, que ce soit dans le tissu industriel, les ménages, en ville, comme dans les zones rurales, c'est largement en deçà la consommation. Donc, alors, c'est donc une occasion. On voit que le terrain, c'est un peu dans notre pays, c'est une terre en friche. La grande partie des populations n'ont pas l'énergie. Donc, c'est une occasion formidable de profiter de cette transition énergétique pour que l'énergie puisse aller dans tous les coins et tous les recoins. Et donc, le gouvernement béninois, n'est-ce pas, s'est engagé depuis quelques années dans l'accès aux équipements photovoltaïques, parce que nous devons dire que notre pays dispose d'un fort potentiel d'énergie renouvelable, fort potentiel. Le soleil brille terriblement. Il y a parfois, de certains endroits, vous avez 40, 45 degrés, 40 degrés de chaleur. Et nous avons des ressources hydrauliques aussi. Et donc, tout cela, c'est quand même un potentiel important au niveau de notre pays, le Bénin. Donc, le gouvernement est donc allé dans cette direction de faciliter un peu l'équipement photovoltaïque. Plusieurs acteurs se sont mis là-dessus pour faire le travail, pour faire le job. Mais il faut reconnaître que malgré cela, le coût de ces équipements photovoltaïques n'est pas accessible à tout le monde. Et ça fait que ce n'est pas encore la bonne, c'est certes la solution, mais les moyens, il manquent. Donc, vu l'immensité de la tâche, le challenge sera très difficile pour notre gouvernement, le pays, de réaliser dans un moyen terme, n'est-ce pas, la transition énergétique si, eh bien, il ne recourt pas à d'autres moyens. Ben, une des pistes, parce qu'il faut dire que nous sommes un pays pauvre et les moyens ne sont pas là, mais une des pistes qui sont envisagées, qui sont possibles, c'est le partenariat envisagé par l'État, c'est le partenariat public-privé. Il y a d'ailleurs dans notre pays une loi sur le partenariat public-privé qui a été votée à l'Assemblée nationale. Et cette loi, n'est-ce pas, c'est déjà expérimenté dans le secteur routier. Le Bénin n'a pas les moyens, concède aux sociétés privées de construction des routes, n'est-ce pas, les possibilités de faire le travail. Et donc, ça marche relativement bien. Ça marche relativement bien, même si on doit dire que c'est un endettement pour le pays. Un endettement qu'il faut reconnaître pour le pays. Et dans ce rôle, les syndicats doivent jouer leur partition. Parce qu'il faut reconnaître qu'aujourd'hui, la grande partie du pays, dans les zones rurales, n'ont pas d'énergie, d'électricité. Et ce qu'on constate, c'est que le Bénin est confronté à ce que vous savez, le terrorisme, le djihadisme est dans notre pays. Et dans les zones les plus reculées, il n'y a pas d'électricité. Il n'y a pas la présence de l'État. Le problème de la lutte contre le terrorisme, ce n'est pas seulement les armes, c'est aussi la présence de l'État dans ces endroits reculés, dans la ruralité, et avec des services publics, les hôpitaux, n'est-ce pas, les écoles, etc. Mais pour ça, pour installer cela, les entreprises, les sociétés, les petites et moyennes sociétés, pour maintenir les gens, pour sentir que l'État est présent. Mais pour que cela soit une réalité, il faut l'énergie, il faut l'électricité. Et donc, il est indispensable de travailler à aller dans cette direction. J'ai écouté tout à l'heure celui qui a parlé et je suis partant pour cette proposition qu'il a faite, à savoir que non seulement le partenariat public-privé peut être une piste, mais aussi le partenariat public-public est une bonne piste aussi. Une bonne piste parce que nous avons les retraites. Chez nous au Bénin, les pensions de retraite, on a la Caisse nationale. C'est une surliquidité. Surliquidité, l'argent est là. Et donc, on peut exploiter cette piste. Moi, je pense que c'est une très bonne piste qui nous a été suggérée tout à l'heure par l'intervenant que nous avons suivi sur les écrans. Il y a donc un défi pour les syndicats de faire de telle sorte que, eh bien, dans cette transition, que l'électricité ne soit pas marchandisée et que des gens se retrouvent avec cela pour s'enrichir sur le dos des travailleurs. Pour cela, nous devons, même si nous ne sommes pas invités ou pas invités, nous devons être dans un creuset, une coalition, une intersyndicale pour influencer les décisions qui vont être prises et aussi la même chose pour intersyndical pour influencer, mais aussi travailler avec les autres, les acteurs de la société civile sur ce défi qui est un défi stratégique. Je vous remercie, j'ai épuisé mon temps, je vous remercie pour l'écoute attentive. Merci bien et vive TUED. Voilà. Merci.
Thank you very much, Comrade. And I think it's quite an important moment for us. I think if we take these presentations that have been that have happened over the last 2 days, Sean, you made mention of how we get into groups. And I think one would definitely be for countries who are on the pathway to making a decision, whether they go privatization or whether they actually choose the public pathway. I think there's lots of experience in this room in how to actually facilitate, support, and encourage the comrades in Benin, as well as the communities and the people there, to actually fundamentally take a choice that's in the direction of the public pathway. And I think there's lots of knowledge and support in this room that can do that. Thanks very much for your presentation. I now hand over to Kavihuha from Namibia, and then I'll give you last.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Mahongora Kavihuha from Namibia, the Regional Congress of Namibia. Namibia is a country we are accurately vulnerable in the sense that most of our energy, close to 71%, is being imported. It is imported from ESCOM, although they are in difficulty, at least they give 18% lights and life in Namibia. Also from Zimbabwe and Zambia. Zambia account for 32% and Zim account for 9%. Of course, the producer is a state, and it produces both from hydro and the coal producers are always on standby. It's not running 24 hours. And we also get some electricity from the Southern African power pool of around 9% as well, in order to light Namibia. However, beside the non-power, we have what we call a regulatory body, which try to regulate prices. But of course, that body is also state appointed, and the influence of the companies in terms of regulating it, the pricing, there is very less public participation, because recently they have even increased the bulk electricity kilowatts with 8%, but the justifications thereof was not shared, not with trade union or public in general. However, on the distribution part, there are 3 companies that are also state, that are, the country is divided into 3 parts, north, central, and west. So now this become a middleman. It was objected severely because when you introduce a middleman, it affects the consumer price. And I'm sure that we also need to interrogate those kind of arrangement. Do we need really to have a middleman through the dismantling approach that is being created here, and who will fit that bill, and to what extent our members are going to be affected. However, also there is a IPP, which also contribute 9% of electricity. 14 of them are solar and only 1 wind. But however, the question comes, can trade union participate in this? I'm sure that people are talking about the public, where they're mentioning about pension fund, and you name, the list goes on. So do you want the trade unions us to engage and also become a kind of IPP? Or what do you want us to do? Because these things, been unpacked. Of course, the pension money is the workers' money. It's not public money. But if we have to redirect our money to be reinvested in this kind of activities, is that approach that we want? Or we need a different approach? Let me boil down now. After a rough background of Namibia, I want to boil down to the topic on the table. What can trade union do? Can we play a role or not moving forward? I think we can, because if we've seen the presentations here, we've seen that some electricity producers are also cross-border with other countries. So I think that we need to start encouraging bilateral agreement between trade unions so that we can start cooperating and start sharing information and research. We also need to encourage this debate to be debated at the regional or sub-regional level, so that because in SADC we have that Southern African power pool and all those kind of things. But I think that trade union, we can play a role there. The other intervention that we can play is how do we play, how do we play our role in terms of redirecting the economy? Because the most important things here is ideological. We have seen that the new graduates from our universities are thinking the West way. None of them think about human being. They think about that if any state have to give resources or assist the community or whoever, those communities are lazy. This is what they have been taught in the universities. How do we trickle down so that we can start playing, influencing those graduates from early stage? I'm sure that all speakers, they talk about various books here, especially the last moderator was quoting and underlining from various books. But are these books be taught to the young people? Or only the narrative that when the state intervene, it means that those communities are poor? And the issues of taxations. Does the money that the state spend only come from tax? Can we not now change the narrative where we can now start demanding that the commodity that we are selling as our community and whatever come from us, it must be reinvested among ourselves? I like the approach of Botswana, where they are talking to the beers now to share 50-50. How many of our countries have moved to that level? How many of our countries have convinced the governments to move that way? And that's why it was deliberate. The question that I asked from my learned daughter, whether the Uganda situation is because of old age or is a convict. He was convinced. Convinced. And the answer is that he was convinced. So I think that with the age come the wisdom of seeing the reality, not being ignorant to the reality. So that must be commended. And I'm sure that we have to push our governments moving forward. The governance issues came prominently. What kind, if you are saying that public pathway, and we know that when we move public pathway, there is a problems of governance. What alternative can we provide a state union to governance? What are we saying? Have we researched? Can we provide a model? Or we talk about public pathway so that whatever parties in power, they can enrich themselves and the life continue and the citizens suffer. So I think that we need to research on that. What kind of governance we want to see so that we ensure that our call for public pathway benefit the people, but not end up in the pocket of few, from experience that we have experienced. The other one is the issues of the taxes. I mentioned about it, the model of productions. What do we want? And that's what I raised earlier. Do we want this dismantling, or we want the same system that take us through to what we want to achieve, so that we can rescue the community in terms of paying the the consume price. The other component is our strategic alliances with the like-minded universities. I'm sure that we have various research institute, but have we, like if you could take an example of Brazil, there is a very, very vibrant University of Campinas. To what extent we've approached them even for them to produce a counter-attack, documents to IMF or to World Bank or to any other capitalist who are saying that to go public is always wrong. I'm sure that will help us to produce counter-attack documents in those. Let me end there for now, then we can engage with the questions. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant, Comrade Kavihuha, because I think what you're doing is, apart from just taking us forward, you're also really practically putting forward suggestions and recommendations, and I think challenges to us as the unions.
Yeah.
I think although you're contextualizing it in terms of Namibia, I think there's a lot of insights that you're providing that can speak to all of us. And I think that's a very positive note, an entry point for my comrade over here.
Yeah.
We thought I made him speak last for the wrong reason, but there you go. Over to Comrade Tawana from SATAWU.
No, thanks, Comrade Hameda. My name is Tawana Mopeli. I'm the Secretariat Coordinator for the South African Transport and Allied Workers Union, that is SATAWU. So before I go into this, when I read the topic, I realized that the topic that we were talking about being neoliberalism's effect, efforts to undermine public energy in the global South, and some countries are taking measures to reclaim their power, and many are resisting to push the push to implement energy privatization. Just reading that topic on its own, you realize that the topic has a lot of concepts, which those concepts in and of themselves have their own contradictions. For an example, the first concept that came out was the concept of neoliberalism, talking about the self-regulating market. And we know that the self-regulating market, what it has done was the market has imposed itself onto social relations, where market is the one that dictates, as opposed to social relations being in the forefront that dictate how markets should actually operate. That was the first problem with the self-regulating market. Secondly, in South Africa, for an example, we've got state-owned enterprises, such as your Transnet and Escoms. But you hear the name state-owned, but then we forget to apply the unity and conflict of opposites of the concept of state-owned. Because in South Africa, a state-owned enterprise is a limited state-owned enterprise. It's de-linked from society, and then it being de-linked from society, it's privatized fully by the state, which is bourgeois in character, and imposes the very same market fundamentalist principles onto the very same society. So that is very fundamental on the nature of the state, and when it convinces us about this transition that is entering into and trying to mitigate crisis, it talks to us about public-private partnerships, public equity partnerships, and now we hear your own state that is owned by the state, a state-owned enterprise owned by the state, telling us we have to privatize because of the mandate of the state. So that is a very big contradiction of the state-owned enterprise. And then it creates a nuance or a contradiction with, should we take, when we renationalize, do we renationalize and take the state-owned, that entity back to a bourgeois state, which itself is saying, no, we must self-cannibalize and actually unbundle ourselves, because we have to create enabling markets for the private sector. And another concept that comes up, which is important, we're talking about resisting the push. Again, that is a fundamental concept in our tradition, the concept of power and resistance. And power and resistance in economic and non-economic institutions. But then what we have always done as labor in most cases, and when you read about labor, we read about labor changing external conditions. However, we forget on the question of resistance, resistance is a power relation, and resistance, if it's not managed as a power relation, can be destructive internally. So we do not speak about our self-criticism as the working class in approaching the current productive social and economic relations. And because the concept is based on power and resistance, comes the question of the global north versus the global south. Again, it talks about the very same structures that are domestic, regional, global. But then when you look at these geopolitical contradictions, we then realize the contradictions between the north versus the south. And then when you come back to it, you realize, okay, within the manner that we are working, the north remains as the metropole, the south becomes the satellite, and we consistently exploit the periphery. That is what the National Development Plan says. We have to create enabling markets within the African region for the private sector, which is private equity partners. I was actually shocked yesterday when I heard that the energy system in Uganda was actually privatized by ESCOM, but then it's collapsing in South Africa. That's a big contradiction. And then as being a trade union as well, because I want to deal with trade union issues, our productive and economic relations, our existence is located in productive relations. And then these productive relations, when you delve deep into the relationship of labor, you realize that labor and nature always enter into a metabolic relationship where they have to contradict the natural resources and then create final products that actually must circulate and benefit us, depending on the forms of production that are there, the type of political economy that is there. Now, we talk about social regulation versus market regulation. And social regulation, are we talking about the regulation where we produce for the purpose of use values, or are we talking about market regulation where we produce for the purpose of exchange value to realize that surplus value, where labor, money, and nature become fictitious commodities? This is why I like these discussions that we find ourselves here, because you find labor grappling with the natural question, and it's where you find the correlation between labor, nature, and however, because of market regulation, money exists, conceals the social relation that labor plays in transforming society. So in most cases, when we talk about labor, it's outside of nature. When we talk about nature, it's outside of labor. And then there's money involved in it, and it conceals the part played by labor in transforming society. So it takes me to the question, you know, when I was looking at it and all of this, irrespective of social regulation, if it's market regulation, we are brought to the same question, the question of extractivism. Some of us, we are in denial of the question of extractivism. You don't want to extract. I remember in Cape Town, we say hole in the hole, oil in the soil. And you're saying, no, they must remain where they are. So labor must not enter into a relationship with them. So how then do we produce? Do we go back? When reality tells us we don't go back, actually time is moving forward. We can learn from the past and then negate the future. So that is where it puts me well when we deal with that concept. Are we talking about planned economy? Are we talking about an unregulated economy that creates fictitious commodities such as labor, nature, and money? So we haven't grappled with that. As a matter of fact, in South Africa, when you look at it, we speak these concepts. Your planned economy. What is a planned economy? Is productive relations wrong, or are we going to move towards a grid that is based on overproduction and for the better good of society advanced by the working class? So, Comrade Hameda, before I conclude, I'm going to come to some of the recommendations we did, especially now when we talk about social regulation. Me and my traditions, my politics, because we are talking about the state. When we say social relations and we are talking about our relationship as the working class with the state, do we still talk about the concepts such as dictatorship of the proletariat, seizure of state control by the working class? Or we simply say, no, status quo, bourgeois state, but institutions take proper mandate from the affiliates, not forgetting that that mandate is coming from the point of production, from the working class. It is when we're talking about participatory forms of democracy. So their representatives in these institutions might not be getting the proper mandates, and not getting the proper mandates, they too, and those institutions that should be democratic, run the risk of becoming oligarchic. Now, two, we have to reimagine. We also spoke about the need for local residential structures. Commodities circulate within communities, but trade unions today, we have moved away from our community role. We have separated from the community, but we are taking decisions for communities. We say we should localize, locally produce, but is it what that community is saying about its forms of production and economic relations? In most cases, no. We are talking from a theoretical perspective, delinked from what is happening in material reality. Now, we have to reimagine trade unionism. I think the pathway that we need right now, trade unionism has to be reimagined. The working class has fundamentally changed. Working class of the 1970s, 80s is different from the working class of today. The working class of today, when you look at it, they're career trade unionists. They are entrepreneurs located in the trade union movement. Our organizing strategies are not resonating with the very same workers. When you call workers meetings, workers do not attend because they feel they do not know what is being said about them. Hence, we need to come up with more initiatives, deal with concepts of democracy, and fundamentally deal with us realizing a destination where we have theoretical leaders and practical leaders as well. So when we merge theory and practice, we can have solutions that actually transform society. I'll pause there.
Thank you very much, Comrade Tawana. I think those were absolutely powerful words on which to close the session, or this part of the session. I think if there was ever a misconception that there's a dearth of knowledge, articulation, and real analysis of what we're confronted with as the trade union movement, I think he is a young comrade, very, very militant, very, very powerful, very passionate, and absolutely articulate in relation to the real challenges. And I think if we're wanting to take forward this particular pathway, I think not only does he present the challenges for us as the labor movement vis-a-vis